Hi everybody, Dave Bloxam here with Beyond Guitars once again, and good to have you with me. I have a special guest here, of course. This is Mike's dad's Gibson Mastertone banjo, and we have had this project for a while. Today the center of attention is on the headstock repair. If you recall, there were several areas of missing finish and missing color on this headstock. It's all finished now, but I want to show you how I got to this point. Now, there is quite a procedure to it, even though it sounds like a very simple thing, just touch up the headstock. As you can tell by all the chemicals I have on the workbench, that it is kind of involved. So we're going to go through all 5 areas on this headstock that needed repair and show you how I did those and how I use the chemicals. And I will show you what I use, how I use it, and exactly what went wrong. Again, like usual on most of my videos, I try something that doesn't work out so well. So I have to pull another trick out of the bag and do something a little different. And it all worked out just fine. So I think what I'm going to do is start off a little different in this video by showing you a before and after on this headstock. And then we will go through how I got it to this point right after this. Okay, class, all eyes on the headstock. The Gibson headstock is where we are paying our attention to today, and I want to point out the areas that need some work. Right under the Gibson logo, I've circled a spot that was damaged probably many years ago, a chip out, and it's also got some perimeter damage to it. On the far right by the second string tuner, I did that. That's sanding through the black lacquer. On the far right, just below it, we have an area that looks like it was probably heat damaged, probably when the headstock and the neck were blistered on the back. And likewise here below on the same side, it is just generally kind of wrinkled up. On the far left, we have a little spot that I sanded through the other day when I sanded the headstock. And below there near the nut, it just looks like wear and tear. Now here's a shot of the headstock after the work was done today. It has only one coat of clear lacquer on it, so it doesn't have the deep luster we're looking for later, but the color has been restored. But I want to talk about Nitro a little bit because it's very important to understand why I like to work with Nitro so much, and that is that it can be repaired. You can do anything with it. You can color it. You can come back and modify it. You can sand it a little bit and add more. You can work with it back and forth and take things down to bare wood if you need to, and then shoot just segments of it. It's highly, highly repairable and modifiable, which is the exact opposite of a 2-part polyurethane. Now, a 2-part polyurethane is definitely, I will admit, completely superior in its protection level to the wood. But you can't do any of these things with it. It goes on and you're pretty well stuck with what you have until the life of the instrument is over. And so I like working with Nitro, but it is a solvent-based finish, and that's the big difference between lacquer and 2-part urethane, which is similar to epoxy. You mix 2 parts and then it just becomes a hard plastic. Nothing has to evaporate from it. And that's not true. That is how nitrocellulose works. What it is nitrocellulose, which is a modified cellulose made from cotton, and I'll get into that a little bit more, but it's able to be dissolved in acetone, and lacquer thinner is primarily acetone. And so what we do is it's dissolved in it, and when it evaporates, the acetone comes out and it leaves the solids behind. The solids then are always soluble by acetone, no matter how old they are. So when we put layers of new finish on top of old, we can take advantage of the fact that the new layer will... My picture's getting a little wobbly here. I don't know what I did. The camera didn't move. That was in editing. But the new finish, because it has the vehicle or the acetone in it, will actually weld into or soften the lower finish that's been there. I don't care how many years it's been there, it's still soluble, and it will adhere to it chemically and join it and kind of weld in. And that's a great advantage, but if you put it on wrong, you put it on too thick, you don't let it evaporate fast enough, you touch it while it's wet, all kinds of things will then damage the finish below. And that's something I don't want to do today, or take the risk of applying finish over the old and actually end up ruining the old, because I want to preserve everything we have here. As you see in the pictures, I'm taping off because I'm about to coat that headstock with a barrier layer. And in years of old, they used to use shellac for this, but I like to use the modern equivalent, or even the modern superior version of it, which is a vinyl sealer. And it really is nice stuff. It works so well. I've even used it to isolate layers of paint that are not compatible. If I have lacquer paint going on over enamel, and it will peel the enamel off. Not if you coat it with this stuff, because it is a complete barrier. So I use that to control what the nitrocellulose does. Now I have it taped off because I don't want to get any of that sealer on the rest of the neck. I don't want it on the fretboard, and I just want it on the face of the headstock, which I was told is probably made of holly wood, not the place, but the actual wood made from holly. What I'm showing here is the color tone vinyl sealer from StewMac, and I bought this. I haven't used it yet, but it is available in cans and in spray cans, so you can use it in spray guns or just all by itself. And the spray cans are certainly very handy. What I'm using here is the Balin product, which is the earlier version of what's now available, the Mohawk. It lasts forever. I have plenty of the Balin. I kind of got a deal on that, so I bought a bunch of it. But the Mohawk is the version now. Mohawk bought out Balin. You can see the Balin part number is still there on the label. But if you're looking for it, Balin is now Mohawk, so you would look for that product there. So I'm getting ready to just tack it off here so I don't have dust on it, because that vinyl sealer can trap dust onto the surface, but it is not a finished coat all by itself. You really do need to coat it with an actual proper coating, because it's not durable, and it's just not made for that. So we're going to give it a couple of swipes to cover it, to give it a nice wet coat of the vinyl sealer, and then we will just leave it alone. You can see it has a nice gloss finish, and that actually goes away when it dries, and everything is looking just perfect. So the matrix that is formed by the nitrocellulose is really different than the matrix by those plastic finishes, and because it is soluble at all levels, it's really, really important to put it on in thin layers. And that's actually how I run into trouble with this job, because the thin layers, I'm using a brush for my touch-ups, which I was hoping would work, but at least I have the barrier coat of the vinyl sealer there to protect the finish underneath. So if I have a wet finish sitting on the surface for an extended time, I'm not afraid that I will melt into and destroy my original finish. So I just want to add to it, not take away from it. But because the brush is a little brutal, I guess you could say, it doesn't have as much control as the spray, and you tend to put on quite a bit more than you would with a spray gun or a spray can. Now, because I have the vinyl sealer on there, I will not get a chemical bond. It will not weld into itself, so I'm creating a capacity here for a mechanical bond by sanding on that vinyl sealer a little bit, and I like to use a little finer grade than they recommend. I go with about a 400 grit sandpaper when roughening up that surface. It's worked okay for me. This is the color tone black lacquer. They were clean out of banjo lacquer, and they said it's on back order for the next 35 years, so I'm going to have to settle with guitar lacquer. That comes from StewMac, and you can spray it on, but I don't want to cover this whole headstock, so I want to apply it only to the key areas, and that's why I thought the brush might be acceptable, with the risk that it goes on kind of heavy. So knowing how lacquer works, and it should go on in thin coats and dry, I knew that was a risk, especially for the biggest area of damage on this, and I did run into a little bit of that, so I went back to using the spray on that one spot. But the brushing worked well on every other spot. So here I'm going to spray it into one of my little sample cups, Yeah, I don't need much at all. I'm doing such little work here, just enough to get the tip on the tip of the brush. And this lacquer is opaque. You can tint lacquer with translucent colors, so you can make it see-through with colors, and you can paint with it like paint and have opaque colors, and it's so versatile. It's just incredible, and you can do these repairs and you can come back and fix it at any time in the future. So this is the spot. This is the one that's the biggest, and I'm trying to level it out, but it is kind of a dip right there. In fact, the dip in the wood is why it's sanded clear of the color, because that dip is where the sandpaper kind of went in, and then it hit the edge of that and sanded off all of the lacquer. Unfortunately, in this shot, I didn't realize I was off frame, but I am just touching up these little spots I pointed out on the previous segment there with the circles showing you where the damage is. And now I'm touching up that chip. It's got kind of a circular area. It looks like it was hit fairly with a kind of a, I don't know what hit it, but it's a little spot of damage. And so I'm filling in the color everywhere I can see it, even though, of course the tuners are going to cover up those little spots, but I can't help myself. I like to spread the lacquer around everywhere I see a problem. So just got to treat nitrocellulose with care, because it can cause as much damage as it can with help your problem. So I kind of get a little of both in this project, where it's helping me with the brush everywhere except that one particular spot. Now, another thing to keep in mind about solvent-based finishes, which in this case we're working with nitrocellulose, is that a good percentage of its volume or its mass is actually the liquid vehicle or the solvent that it's liquefied by. And lacquer thinner is primarily acetone, although there are some other solvents in it. But it gets lighter, it gets smaller, it shrinks when that evaporates out. So when you put these thin layers on and you let it dry, you'll find that layer is much thinner than it was when you applied it. And another reason why you need to build up multiple coats to have any real significant thickness, because it continues to shrink every time you let it dry. It contracts, and that is another reason why you need to put it on thin, because if you put a mass of this stuff on and it starts to shrink, it really doesn't do well. It shrinks into it kind of crumples up and gives you a bad finish. Another thing that happens is pinholing, because it's drying too fast or it's too thick, and the vapors are trying to get out through this bubble of liquid or semi-liquid finish that it's resisting, and I run into that. That's what happens to me in this one. It's pinholing, and we take care of it. But if you understand these kinds of pitfalls and things that can happen, you can avoid them, or at least, because lacquer is so forgiving, you can mess up all you want and you can go back and just do it again and fix it. Now, just to contrast that, and why I think so many people are afraid to use lacquer, is that the polyurethane finishes and other poly types don't have any evaporation, so they don't have pinholing. You can put them on as thick as you like. They just harden where they stand, and they don't rely on atmospheric evaporation or anything else like that. So no shrinking and no contracting of the finishes. So in that respect, they are easier, but I find them to be much more limiting, actually. So I just keep talking, even though the scenery here changes. But what I'm doing in the video now is taking some dried lacquer. I sprayed this cup with the lacquer, but over the time I've been using it, it is completely dried. But I'm demonstrating how it's soluble once again. So all I have to do is add a little bit of lacquer thinner. I had some in that bottle to clean my brush, so it had a little bit of color to it, but really it's just lacquer thinner. And you can see I've got viable lacquer here that I can actually use just by putting a little thinner in there. And then once again, it has come to life. So it's good to use again. So I use it, it's actually just fine. Nothing about it has changed in its nature. So I'm ready to apply it to my headstock. Now, I did some filing on this headstock already, and you can see that it's leveled off a little bit. And I haven't given up on this repair yet, but I will eventually, because of those little pinholes you can see in the surface. it doesn't look real smooth, so I decide to give up on that eventually, but not yet, because in this stage I'm still trying to make it work. Now, I jumped ahead a little bit here because I think I edited out a description of what I said, and I said something really strange. I said something about filing. Well, I like to use files in this work because they like to hit high spots the best. And I mentioned this when I was leveling the fretboard and doing the fretboard repairs, if you recall. And I've got a mechanical background, and years ago I earned my A&P airframe and power plant aviation mechanics license, and learned how to do some filing in that training that was valuable to me later in a lot of ways. But there's a special technique used with a single cut flat file that I used on this lacquer because I didn't want to take off all of the finish across the whole headstock, which sandpaper is really good at, but a file will tend to take off mostly from the high spots. So I thought, you know what, I would use a technique I learned called draw filing, using what's called a flat bastard file. And I know that's an odd name. It's probably about 600 years old. It goes back many years. I'm not sure why that term refers to a file of all things, but it does. And when you shop for a file now, you'll see some that are called a bastard file. Now, they have a single cut, unlike some of the files I use for other purposes, taking more material off. But because it's a single cut, you can use it sideways as well as back and forth. So that's what I do. I use it sideways, and that tends to make a very, very smooth finish. And I learned that from repairing propellers that have stone chips in them. And when you're barreling down a runway with a high RPM propeller, the propeller hits a stone that gets kicked up for one reason or another, and it puts a chip in the metal. And those chips have jagged edges, and those jagged edges can turn into cracks, and then the propeller can fail. And if you're at 6,000 feet, that's not a very good thing. You can't just pull over. So we like to try and mitigate problems before they occur, and do what's called draw filing and smooth out that jagged finished chip into more of a smooth little dip that's just a smooth contour. And those shapes don't tend to crack, especially when they've been finished off with a fine file. So what I decided to do was try filing down some of the high spots with a flat file, single cut bastard file, and I have one of those here. And when I let the lacquer, I build up the lacquer until it's a little bit proud and then file it down. It works out really well because I really am trying to preserve as much finish on this as I can and take off only the areas that I want to, and those happen to be the high spots. Well, I'm a little bit low. You have to build the lacquer up in layers. So at this point right now, we are slightly low in some areas, and I was just pointing out in the video what those areas are. So I'm breaking out the little bit of lacquer I have in this, and I'm going to touch up some of these low spots and hopefully turn them into high spots. So we're going to start with these three little areas right there that need a little bit of buildup. They're shiny still because the file didn't touch them. And then I've got that main area over to the left there by the second string tuner, or the hole for the tuner. And that turns out to be a problem area because we do a little buildup on that a little too fast, and it's hot weather and tends to evaporate a little too fast. Now that's a problem with lacquer. It can cause a problem like that because the vehicle, or primarily the acetone that the nitrocellulose is dissolved in, is trying to escape, and the hotter it is, the faster it escapes, and it creates little pockets or bubbles in the finish. They're very tiny. They look just like little pinpoints, and it just isn't a very smooth finish. What I want is a smooth finish. So I noticed that these little pinholes in the finish, it's something that it's one of those things that lacquer can do. And lacquer is problematic. It's kind of fussy. You have to kind of understand why certain things happen with it in order to successfully use it. But because of those pinholes, I'm going to end up removing some of that and using a spray. So that's the only spot that I have to do that. You'll see right under the Gibson logo, that turns out just fine. And all the other areas, but over there by the second string tuner, we have to do a little masking and spraying. So we'll get to that. But that's the thing about lacquer. If you understand it and you see problems, you know what they are. And then you just know how to kind of steer around them. Those kinds of problems are one of the things that really turn people off about lacquer, I think, because you need to have the right temperature and humidity, and you can't put it on too heavy, you can't put it on too thin. But I've worked with it so much that I kind of understand these things. Here I'm showing you the draw filing technique, just taking that file across. Now, the nice thing is that I can lay it flat across the main body of that headstock and not tip it, and it won't dip into that low spot that's over there by the second string tuner and carve out the lacquer too much, because that's kind of a scoop in the surface of the wood, and when you draw a file through that or even sandpaper, it's going to remove all the finish down to the wood right next to the low spot. So not actually in the low spot, but right next to it. So that's what happened there. So I'm going to do a little bit of filing here, and then one more time we need to fill it, and I'm going to give up on the pinhole area because that needs to be repaired. So we'll get to that. I'm putting more pressure over on this side, but it's very light and very slow. But that's about as much as I'm going to get out of it. I will use micro mesh, some micro mesh to polish it out. But I'm going to give it one more little coat of nitro here with my brush. Now, I was contemplating using an airbrush, but I've voted myself out of that because I'm not doing a whole area. I'm just doing little spots. So with that in mind, I can see the file is not touching over here because it's not dull. So I'm going to build up a little bit more finish there. And I'm really close to being done with this. I don't see any bare spots or rough spots elsewhere. Maybe a tiny bit there. That's covered by the truss rod cover, though. But just a little bit. That won't take long to dry. And I've already added some here, and it's warm tonight, so it has dried to some degree. But maybe just add a little bit. The file takes it down really quickly once it hardens. And so that's it for another few hours. I'm going to leave it like that. Well, here we are after the initial filing was done, and I built up another little bit on that problem area. And at this point, I now know that I'm at my final opportunity here to make that work. And where I'm pointing, that is the little pimple there that looks so bad. Everything else on that now is looking pristine. One thing I'll do too with the file is I draw a file across that here. You'll see that I switch the angle on my file. I like to swing it a little bit too so that I'm not moving as much at the opposite end because I don't want to take finish off over there. And I'll switch it around. I'll switch the angles on the file. So the only common spot that I'm always going over, no matter what my angle is that spot. And I can share some of the other abrasion across all the rest of the headstock and hopefully only take off enough in that spot to bring it down where I want it. Well, I am doing a little direct filing on it, but you know, I am kind of worried about that at this point. And I realize that the little bubbles in that are not going away. So with everything else looking as good as it is, I decided that I would switch gears on this headstock, in at least that one spot, and do something a little different. Well, it wasn't hard to undo. I just put a little lacquer on that spot, and I was able to kind of dig out the lacquer from that area down to my my barrier layer with the vinyl sealer. And I've I don't know what happened to my footage here. I've done one coat at least at this point, and I'm doing another one. You can see that I've got the masking tape. It's all black now because I sprayed it, but I've got that spot showing, and I have sprayed a little bit on it. And the nice thing about spray is that it goes on really thin, and it's able to dry really, really fast. In fact, I'm using a very, very cool heat gun, which really is there just to provide some air. And it will dry fast and still not give me the pinholes because it's gone on so thin. But about 3 or 4 layers of that, and I do some more filing on it. And this is what we end up with. Just doing one clear coat to kind of seal the deal, and that will weld into the finish that we've got. And that's it for today. That's going to dry, and we'll just leave that alone. But we've got more work to do on this banjo. Of course, we have to seal or fill the grain on the mahogany neck. We've got to level the frets. I think I'll hold that off till about last. And refinishing. So we've got color and finish coats to put on this neck. So hope you learned something about Nitro, why I like it so much. You can repair and modify any finish at any time, which is nothing you can do with a polyurethane finish. It's just absolutely versatile. I know it's finicky. You've got things like temperature and humidity and dry time and air circulation and how thick you put it on. But you get used to those things. And once you know it, it's really an absolutely fantastic finish to work with.